Okay. Amina, I think I can start. Ibrahima, je peux commencer?
Oui, c'est bon, vous pouvez commencer.
Okay, merci. Good afternoon to everybody, good evening or good morning, wherever you are. And thank you for joining us in this third edition of the Publishing Africa series. My name is Divine Fu. I am the director of Human Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. Also a researcher within the Knowledge Activism project. And also the speaker for today. Our colleague Itai, who was to chair this session, is not feeling well today and has asked that we should both chair and speak. So I'm going to try to assume both roles at the same time. But the Publishing Africa series focuses on questions of publishing and knowledge dissemination in Africa. This series is a collaboration between Human Institute for Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town, and a last part, which is a laboratory which is based at the Gaston Berger University in Senegal, and also with Open Society, the Open Society Foundations, who are funding this project. So the project involves researchers who are doing research in the 4 different parts of the continent. Yusra Hamdouai, who is one of our postdocs who is doing research in North Africa. We have Ibrahima Niang, who is doing research in Western Central Africa. And we have Itai Makone, who is doing research in Southern Africa and also Lusophone Africa. And we have Job Mwara, who is doing research in East Africa, in Swahili Africa, and also a part of Anglophone Africa. The project also involves a group of publishers who are doing work on the what we call the market research or market report. And their aim is just to try to understand the business business sustainability of publishing. And in the months, weeks ahead, we are also recruiting a group of 54 researchers across the African continent who will be doing, helping us to write national reports. The project is done in several languages, as you would have seen, and we aim at the end of the year and every year to publish a report which is focused on the state of African scholarly publishing. At HUMA, it is housed within the project that we called Knowledge Activism. And at last part, it is done in collaboration or within the context of another project called Global Africa, which involves the development of publishing on the continent, launching a new journal, and also trying to strengthen publishing, especially university presses, on the continent. And in last part, it is funded by the AFD, or the Agence France de Développement. So this is the third in this series, this seminar series. There is also a podcast series, which we are going to be launching soon with a series of podcasts that are already under production. And every a month or every 2 weeks, we're going to have a talk in English, another talk in French, alternating also with Arabic and Portuguese. So today, I will be speaking. Like I said, I'm assuming 2 roles today. The moderator, because Itai is just falling ill, and also I will be speaking. So I'm going to speak. I've been told that I'll be speaking for 20 or so minutes, and then we're going to open up the floor for a discussion. Yeah. So we did circulate a paper And I want to thank Itai and Ibrahima and other colleagues, for inviting me, to speak to this conversation, which I think began many years ago. So I did circulate a paper which I began to write sometime last year, and which is on the back of another paper which I presented early last year. So this emerges out of my own interest in publishing, my own interest in knowledge production, my own interest in Pan-African knowledge production, and also my experience trying to produce knowledge or to promote the production of knowledge by Africans or by African institutions. The paper is entitled Publishing Africa Towards Rebuilding a Disobedient Publishing Ecosystem. And in this paper, I think there are several concepts that are important, for us to hold. One is the notion of ecosystem, which is important because an ecosystem describes an entire whole, an interdependent whole. Disobedience, which is just this really a strong a refusal, to obey rules and commands of someone in authority, but which in this instance is more what one would call a theoretical push, because we are building on Mignolo, Walter Mignolo, and Hamid Dabashi with what is called epistemic disobedience, which is a line of thinking which is grounded in decolonial thought, but also in debates about decolonization or knowledge decolonization. And then we have the notion of rebuilding, and I use that concept deliberately, because rebuilding, which means to build, but also to rebuild, to put back, give life to something that has disappeared. And there, what I'm trying to do is also just to make a basic argument that structural adjustments, as I think I've made over and over, and many others have made, structural adjustments had a really negative impact on the knowledge ecosystem and the knowledge infrastructure on the continent. And the structural adjustment was not just meant to deal with to reject the economy, but one of his objectives was actually to kill the knowledge infrastructure on the continent, because when one is unable to think, even when one has eaten and one has resources, one actually loses all dignity. And then we have the notion of publishing, which is also about knowledge production, and which is talking about a whole infrastructure, which is starts from when we actually conceptualize knowledge, when we think about knowledge, and then grows to the processes involved in producing knowledge, in processing knowledge, which is from editors, to copy editors, to writers, to translators, to people who disseminate dissemination infrastructures that we often neglect, to databases, to repositories, to bookstores and booksellers. So there's a whole infrastructure that is involved in publishing, in knowledge production and dissemination, that is important, to take into consideration when one is speaking about publishing ecosystem. So that I thought it was important just to start off by speaking to these really key concepts that are in the title, but that might not have been really deepened in the paper, but that are really important for us to have this conversation. So I start off this paper, which was born, which I began to write when in May, during the context of Africa Month here in South Africa and in many other parts of the world, but which also coincided with the brutal murder of George Floyd. And that is when I start the paper by talking about the need that is on the neck of the knowledge production ecosystem, on the continent, and it's a need that has asphyxiated, the continent and its knowledge production, for so many years, and that despite the continent demonstrating a growth, in authors, as Elsevier has demonstrated in its statistics around the growth of authors around the world, that despite the fact that Africa has promised, still its knowledge infrastructure still remains largely underdeveloped. Its publishing infrastructure, in particular, remains largely underdeveloped. And even when it is underdeveloped, it is actually highly disrespected. And what's even sad about it is that this disrespect is not just from outside the continent, but it is also from the continent. And we see this actually demonstrated through many practices. We can name so many examples, whether it is in selection committees where it is important to have published abroad to be considered as someone who counts, or whether it is colleagues and others who, at the point of a publication, the thought is always to orient themselves towards what Poleno Tonji would call extraversion. That we constantly think that we need to be able to curate the knowledge that we produce, in publishing institutions and infrastructures that are located outside of the continent in order to gain value. And there are many reasons for this. I mean, also it relates to the fact that the culture of academia, as many people have argued, if we not just Poleno Tonji, but many other scholars of decolonization whom we can list, whether we are talking about Chandra Mohanty and her argument that we really cannot think through Western eyes, whether we are talking about people like Ifi Amadiome or Yeronke, or people who've argued very deeply, or the Achille Mbembes or the Francis Nyamjus, who argue that really thinking through frameworks or eyes that one borrows, from outside, are often problematic, and we need to find other ways, to be part of this knowledge ecosystem. So it does make sense that quite often when one many scholars who publish, outside the continent are considered to be extraverting. But it's always instinctive to publish outside the continent, because when one looks at standards, when one looks at what is defined as standard, when one looks at what is defined as quality, these are concepts or notions that are always grounded, in ideas that are born out of particular knowledge culture systems. So like the Bashi and Mignolo, and also I think Amina Mama has made the same arguments. I have seen Oyeronke has made the same arguments, and many scholars, whether we are talking about Homi Baba and his argument about the third space, many of these scholars of decolonization or post-colonial studies, have argued that the critique is not necessarily that one needs to wipe out a particular system and provincialize, but what we want is to enrich, to be able to decenter, as Suleiman Bashir Dian would argue, that we need to decenter hegemonic knowledge systems and knowledge structure. So it can allow us, to include, other perspectives. So there is an instinct always to publish outside, because quality belongs outside, and it's a particular idea of quality. And we can see also with ranking practices that when we take criteria to rank, whether we are ranking a professor, we are ranking a scholar, the tendency is when you find a name, the first thing you do is to search that name. Or when you are in a selection committee, you want to search a name, you want to see, where have you been indexed? When you find a journal publishing or promoting itself, it has to use all of these numerical values or frames, to show that it has made it, that it has succeeded. And we will ask, where are you indexed? Are you in Web of Science? Are you in, EBSCOhost? Where do you find yourself? Because these are the places where we think you have attained a quality. These are the spaces where we think you've actually met a certain standard that we can actually endorse, as a valuable standard. So what I'm doing in this work or in this paper is to try to decenter that and to pose questions, what it would mean to be thinking through different eyes. What would it mean to take Chandra Mohanty seriously in publishing, for example? What would it mean to think through different eyes? If thinking through Western eyes is problematic, how do we think through other eyes, particularly within the publishing sector, on the continent? And I also trying to respond to Pauline Otonji's critique about extraversion and the fact that our infrastructure is oriented towards a production that is meant, for outside, that our role is just to offer the raw material, for knowledge production or for knowledge systems globally. So it's not surprising that within the context of decolonization, journals and many publishing houses, in the North run to the continent, to pick up any journal they can find and build up. So if you look across the continent, you will find that a large proportion of many journals that we see as what that we consider high quality journals are journals that actually are published or distributed by some of the major publishing houses, outside the continent. And this is what I think Pauline Otonji would also frame as extroversion, and what I think Mohanty would think as thinking through the eyes, of others. And so how do we have a conversation, with ourselves? So I start in the paper, use the example of my experience, in Coetzee, Coetzee, which has operated for about 45 years, and a place where I entered with a lot of passion and a lot of commitment, to the Pan-African project, to the Pan-African Knowledge Project. At Coetzee, I was head of publications and dissemination, also having been the founding managing editor of Langa Publishers, which is headquarters also in Cameroon, and also having served, as editorial assistant to so many different journals and been on the board of many journals. So being in a space where one would be seen to be producing knowledge for the continent was really key, for me. And it was interesting, to find in this space that many researchers, despite receiving grants, from Coetzee, and despite Coetzee sometimes investing lots of resources to process the knowledge that they had collected, some of the data that they had collected and some of the stuff that they had written, and that they would elect, to rather publish outside. So when it was a good manuscript, many researchers wanted to publish it outside. I'm trying to not name publishing houses in order not to have anyone on the spot, but just to say that many researchers would elect, to publish their stuff outside for so many reasons. I mean, and some of the reasons were always very interesting. Some was just that they knew the person who was doing the publication, and that, I see Divine every day. I have attire with Divine. I have rice with Divine on a daily basis. What the heck could he produce, for me? So this kind of familiarity was seen as really problematic, and distance for some was really important because they thought quality was a key. A quality requires some notion of objectivity where distance and not being too close, to the person was a key part of it. But I do demonstrate, in the paper how, many quarrels with professors, and how these professors insist, even with the resources that the organization has given them, to publish outside. And sometimes when you published their books, and the books had become famous, and then they took these books, to other publishing houses outside, to make money. And these are challenges, and the question here is, how do you change the mind? How do you transform this mind? How do you orient people towards adopting publishing, on the continent as a politics, So they and publishing on the continent not as a form of provincializing or as a kind of ethno-nationalist politics, but just as a way, as a politics that is meant, to support and grow the publishing industry, within the continent. So I try to demonstrate that example. Then I move on to talk about questions of infrastructure after theoretical debates. And my aim is mainly to just try to identify problems, try to explore a path towards how we can solve these problems. And the problem here is really key. How do we value journals on the continent? How do we value publishing houses on the continent? How do we value the infrastructure on the continent? How do we also develop the infrastructure on the continent? Because we must acknowledge that the infrastructure is also problematic. I mean, there are lots of issues which people raise, like, at Codesria, people would tell you how their papers had been in the system, for 5 years, or for 6 years, or 7 years. And if you go through many publishers across the continent, a colleague told me yesterday about a manuscript that was published by a publisher here in South Africa, and which had been with the publisher for the past 5 to 7 years. So it just got published, yesterday. So you have these challenges, many of these challenges that are real challenges. But the question is, how do we support the industry? How do we adopt a politics, to ensure that we continue to have our conversations within the industry on this continent, and while at the same time having to deal and address, some of the key issues. I try to demonstrate also there that what we need is a kind of a solidarity across the board, solidarity which allows us to constitute what I call knowledge activism. And our knowledge activists whose job is to make sure that they disobey, that they work towards this delinking, because this epistemic disobedience and also delinking is part of this decolonial project. But also just to emphasize that delinking is not necessarily having to provincialize and to completely cut ourselves out of the West, but it's more, to do what I think it's Mbembe who talks about expanding, the archives, or doing what Homi Baba talks about, looking for a third space. So how do we find a third space that is hybridized, where we can actually have voices that are included, in this discussion on, on publishing. And then I argue that, when where one could borrow is to borrow from feminist work, and feminist struggles or feminist strategies, to deal with emancipation, because in this case, we are talking about knowledge emancipation, and we are talking about how to emancipate, the publishing infrastructure on the continent that has, struggled or been devalued, for a long time. And in seeking to emancipate, we have to adopt what I think is a two-prong or a three-prong strategy. The first, I start by discussing Sarah Ahmad and her a framing and a framework concept of complaint, and the fact that the discussion around publishing on the continent is often that we are complaining. But if we take Sarah Ahmad's concept that complaining is in itself a form of disruption and a way of resistance, and also the beginning of an entire process, then we actually need to assert ourselves by even complaining more. So that is one of the key issues, or one of the first steps that I think one needs to do. Then the second step is what I think Langa had adopted when Langa was founded. I was one of the founding managing editors, of Langa. And the idea is that when one has lost his voice, the first thing is that one needs to be heard first. And our first step is first to disrupt this idea of quality and of standards, and first to just have quantity. Because at this point, when one story has not been told, the first thing is to be able to curate our stories, by ensuring that the space is flooded by so many of our stories that every time that one wants to talk about particular issues, either on the continent and out of the continent, one necessarily needs to borrow and build upon the existing archives of stories that are already, not there. And then I say the second step is to move towards what one would begin to think is quality assurance, where we begin to work as collective, to find ways, of redefining what we mean by quality and what we mean by standards. Because at this point, we are really busy chasing standards and qualities that are often escaping us, but we have to be more assertive about what we mean by quality and what we mean by standards, because that's the core of defining what knowledge is. But this is also going to redefine what the publishing industry, what the knowledge production ecosystem will be doing. And it's a way of introverting so that we are not spending our time working to compete, with a global standards. It's not that these global standards are not important, but just that we need to look for other alternatives. And then I would move on to a talk and still building on feminist strategies, of disruption and also organization, but also emancipation. That we have to find, other ways to not just build quality, to not just make sure we flood, with quantity, but also to ensure that there is a really deep investment in the infrastructure, and that solidarity is a really important part of that infrastructure. Here I want to particularly, for example, build on this context of the African Free Trade Agreement, which is an opportunity. I mean, I don't want to think about the scenes that have been going on in the Pan-African Parliament today and yesterday, which really discourage anyone to talk about Pan-Africanism, in this context, but that it is important that as these conversations are happening, that we as knowledge activists and also as people in the publishing sector and people who are pushing to develop knowledge infrastructure, that we begin to push for policies that allow for knowledge circulation across the border. So we can do what Mignolo and others are pushing for, to have conversations with ourselves, because we cannot have conversations with people, essentially with people outside. And to have conversations with ourselves means that knowledge producers need to circulate across borders, and that knowledge itself needs to circulate across borders. Also with experience with coetzee and many other, I think, publishers and distributors will tell you probably about organizing book fairs across the continent, that it is quite tough, to circulate books in certain countries, and also that to trade books across borders is also really expensive. So the issue of taxes, for example, on knowledge products is something that we actually have to think about, really seriously. That taxes need to fall, questions about visas, for example, for knowledge producers, that students need to circulate across borders, researchers need to circulate across borders, so that's why I'm talking about the ecosystem, that each and every one of these players needs to contribute, to ensure that this disobedience, which is ensuring that we disobey global standards, that we have conversations with ourselves, that we are able to contribute to this global knowledge production system, that this disobedience actually happens, and that governments need to play a part, but that also we have to play a part, and that ultimately we as knowledge producers need to adopt a certain politics, and a certain politics which is having to patronize, and support, because it is by patronizing and supporting local knowledge infrastructure that we are able to give it value, despite all of its struggles. I think it is Foucault who talks about tension as very productive. That is also why it's great to be seeing the scenes happening in the Pan-African Parliament, because in the process, it leads to some resolution. So every tension leads to a resolution, even if the resolution, even what comes after it is not necessarily constructive, but it's a productive process because it leads to something. So what we need to do is to try to reactivate what we already have, as existing, a system. So in the end, what I'm trying to do is more of playing with ideas. And I mean, just to end that, I'm trying to pose a very simple question, which is like, how do we transfer a decolonization, into the publishing, sector? And I think that we can only do that by, one, responding to Paulina Tenji's critique about extraversion, and that, two, we need to take seriously the critique that particularly African feminists, have raised about particular kinds, of how the continent is think and how knowledge produced by the continent, is thought. Whether it's trying to look for alternatives of thinking through Western eyes, how do we think through local eyes, but also that we have to adopt the practices, feminist emancipation practices, which allow for particular kinds of solidarities and also particular kinds of assertiveness. I think that I will end there for now, just to allow for space for more discussions and conversations. Thank you, colleagues. Great. Ibrahima and Amina, I think that I will open up for questions. I unfortunately have to chair today, and at the same time.
I can chair. Even I have class in in 25 minutes, so I will chair before I go to Shehanta job. So thanks, Divine, for this insightful talks, which is for me a way of our intellectual revolution and academic revolution in this geopolitics of knowledge production. I think these talks is very, very insightful, and it's for me a gateway for what we have to do and what we have to make to set up a new way of knowledge production and publishing in Africa. So I just would like to, before let the colleagues to ask some question, I just would like to ask my question. It concerns the institution. What is the part of the university or the institution like CAMES, which encourage people to publish more in abroad because of the ranking or the way that they think that you have to publish more paper in books from abroad, which enable you to advance in your career. This is one remark that I would like to make, and I would like to know what you think about it.
Yeah, thank you, Ibrahima. Yeah, I think, I mean, CAMES is important. I should start. I think it's important to explain that CAMES is like in Francophone Africa, CAMES is like the NRF, in South Africa. It's the institution which is responsible for overseeing promotions, academic mobility and progression. So it's like a quality assurance body. But what's interesting is that CAMES itself, is one of those institutions that I think Tenji itself would call one of those extroverted organizations, because it comes from the colonial history. and that scholars need to subject themselves in Senegal or much of Francophone, much of the Francophone world need to subject themselves through this process, this umbrella institution, and compete, annually, for promotion. Yeah, you asked for the role of institutions. Yeah, institutions do play a very important role because power is really key. When one needs to disrupt one of the tools that one needs is power. And institutions do hold this power, but institutions also have to deal with their contradiction because on the one side, you have institutions that are promoting a lot of this discourse on decolonization, but who at the same time want to play the politics, of being global players. So, but the question is how do you provincialize, or how do you balance both? Because you run the risk of provincializing by saying that everything needs to be local, and then you also run the risk of just extroverting if you want to be global. But it actually means that certain practices of defining what we consider as value, an acceptable value, are things that need to shift. And that is why unless we invest in defining what we see as standards and what we see as quality, we would be wasting time, because you can publish in a journal in Saint Louis or in a publishing house from my own village, in Bafut. But if what is considered to be standards and what you consider to be quality is still oriented towards what Otunji would call extraversion, then you still have a problem, because you have not disrupted or delinked, to use Samir Amin's concept. You still have not delinked. So institutions need to invest first in defining what we see as quality. What is a standard journal? When somebody publishes in a journal of sustainability in Ibadan, and somebody publishes in a sustainability science journal in Tokyo, is Ibadan less valuable than Tokyo? What makes Ibadan less valuable than Tokyo? So those are tough questions that we need to pose ourselves, onto the point at which we think that people in Ibadan are having a conversation with people in Ibadan or people around Ibadan. Then we are actually wasting time. And lastly is just investment in resources. I mean, how many universities on the continent actually run their own presses? How many universities actually invest in having journals as platforms through which they can actually do their own propaganda? So and you have examples, people publishing great articles, great books on decolonization and sustainability, but curated somewhere else. So universities, institutions, government institutions, university institutions, and others, we do play a really key role to shift this. Thanks.
So thank you for your answer. So if colleagues would like to ask some question, otherwise I think I have another question concerning not the academics, but the leaders. Our leader, when they published their books, they did not choose the local editor. They used to go in France and use Robert Laffont or some editor like that. Do you think that it's like a kind of neo-colonialism way of publishing, or giving more trust on the Western editor than the local editor?
Yeah, again, I want to emphasize that decolonization is not provincialization. So decolonization is an act of enrichment. So decolonization is not to dismiss what is already there. Decolonization is supposed to enrich, to ensure that we are part of a global conversation. So I think it's important for me to make that clear. So the emphasis is not on dismissing what already exists, or on dismissing the West or dismissing the North. It is to enrich, but it is to ensure that we are able to bring on board another voice. We are unable to bring on board another perspective. And I'm arguing that we can only do that by patronizing, by developing our knowledge infrastructure, our publishing infrastructure in particular, because publishing plays a really key role in gatekeeping. It plays a key role through peer review, for example, peer reviewing through particular house styles, through particular frameworks, particular arguments that publishing houses adopts, through a particular politics that a publishing house adopts. And unless we are able to do that, I think we will not be able to redefine, the terrain. And people can choose. I mean, if our leaders publish outside, I mean, of course it's problematic, but of course they have a reason to publish outside. I think people should have the choice to publish where they should publish, but we should not devalue the publishing infrastructure on the continent just because it does not meet up with certain standards that Otonji would call extroverted.
Okay, thank you. So I will let the Wangui Kimari to ask questions. Wangui,
thank you. I hope I've not jumped the queue. I think Marguerite maybe has a question as well, but maybe I'll make mine fast. Thanks so much, Divine. So many things to think about because I'm also, I've been indoctrinated to not think about publishing locally. So I also need to decolonize myself. But my two questions are, as part of this decolonization, Ngugi always talks about publishing in your own language. But then the catch-22 is for publishers, perhaps like Langa or others, if you publish in Gikuyu or another language, your readership is small and thus it's not lucrative or profitable to publish in that indigenous language. So I was just wondering about your thoughts on this. But my second question, which I'll sneak in a bit sneakily, is that recently I've noticed in big journals, mostly anthropology ones, is that you have an option of submitting an abstract in different languages. So for example, in English, but then you can have a supplementary one in Swahili or something else. And I wonder if this is what you think about this. Is this fetishization of languages, or is this, because I'm not sure, as much as I also submit perhaps an abstract in Swahili, but I don't know what the impact is. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Can I take like the three questions and then I respond to the three questions? I saw that Amina's hand was up and I see Anne and Marguerite. If I could take Ibrahima, can I take those questions and then before I respond?
Okay, go on.
Thank you. Amina?
Thank you so much, Divine. I posted my question on the chat, but I can read it, and it's about the politics of referencing, which is very much linked to the publishing aspect. And I remember reading something along the lines which that Ahmed has written, is that it's not necessarily how much you publish, and I think you really highlighted that, and Wangui's question also covered some of that. When you publish in your own language, your readership is not only small, but the question becomes who references you can actually push you towards the academic scene, as if the referencing provides that validation that your knowledge has been sort of embraced by significant scholars or academics. And I just wanted to understand from your perspective if you see that as a sort of violence or academic violence when you're not actually being referenced by the people that you'd like to be referenced by, or by the authors who influence your thinking, and more so in the contemporary academic world. Yeah, so I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Anne has a question.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question about infrastructure and about publishing infrastructure in particular, because at the African Studies collections at Frankfurt University in Germany, where I'm working, we've got a policy that we only buy African published books, so only books and also journals which are published on the African continent. But when they're paper versions, they're very difficult to get to Germany, or even the journal in Ibadan that you mentioned. How is that going to get to, for example, Dar es Salaam when it's a paper version? And so while there's value in paper versions, you have this difficulty. Then when you've got digital versions, you sometimes have the difficulty that when they disappear, they're completely gone. It's not like a paper version that can be archived and that can be found again somewhere. So I'm kind of wondering about this infrastructure question, which you mentioned in your talk, circulation of books and so on. And I would be happy if you could expand on that a bit and let me know your thoughts.
Okay. Did Marguerite have a question?
Mine was also sort of linked to the questions of language, just in terms of the language we use and how that shapes the way that we think or frame something and how we behave. So just, you touched on it already, just the word of decolonization. I'm also just curious if we were to use words like African Renaissance or, you know, how does that compare to decolonization? How does it shape the behavior that we take on?
Okay. Thank you very much. These are very these are very good questions, but also very tough questions. I'm going to start with Wangui. Yeah, Wangui, I think Gugi's critique is a very important critique. But again, let me emphasize that my critique is not necessarily about provincializing, and I think that's also Ngugi's contribution, that it's about enriching. So I still think that we should give people the choice to be able to publish in the language in which they feel comfortable, and also in the language in which they want to have a conversation with, you know. And whether we published in our own languages and in other languages, I think the practice of translation is something that we really need to introduce. I think in some institutions such as coetzee, this has been developed really, really well. Coetzee has tried so many different models, you know, publishing in different languages in the same book, having to publish a book in one language and translate to another language, just to ensure that people should have conversation. I think the thesis should be that we should be able to have conversations with each other. And to have conversations with each other means that we need to curate knowledge in a form and in a language that allows us to have conversation with each other. And I think indigenous languages, however we take indigenous languages to be, publishing in indigenous languages is really important. But to publish in indigenous language also requires an infrastructure. And that's why the infrastructure question is really important. An infrastructure which is in terms of a lot of actors, you know, in the ecosystem, in the process of publishing. You know, when you need people to solicit manuscripts within a language, to understand what is it in this, not just in the language, what is it in this debate, in this discussion that is important, you know, to curate or to circulate. You need to have, you know, peer reviewers, for example. You need to have copy editors. You need to have you know, proofreaders. You need to be able to have people who can promote it, can write promotions, you know, for those book people. You need to be able to launch that book and put it within a specific context. So there is an entire infrastructure that we need to develop to ensure that this happens. And what I'm pushing for is that we need to invest in that infrastructure. It is not just enough to talk about decolonization. We need to translate it in the publishing space by having to invest in that infrastructure. And then you spoke about abstracts. I think the translation into different abstracts is also trying to do what some others have been doing. I mean, for many years, coetzee was always translating some of his articles, but also having his abstracts published in different languages, in English, in French, in Arabic, and in Portuguese. But also because of the diverse community, because Pan-Africanism as translated in that space meant having conversations across the board. So you can ensure that at every one time, a group of other people should have a conversation. I mean, there are lots of issues also and challenges with doing it. Like I think Francis Nyamjo has written about this in the book dedicated to Chakava, which is publishing Africa. I think he's got a whole chapter around there about the challenges of translation and the difficulties of having to translate, to other people. But I think Wangui is a practice that we need to promote. We need to invest in local publishing. We need to invest in publishing in other languages, but we also need to invest in making sure we translate it so that others outside of that space can actually have a conversation. Because at the end of the day, we're having a conversation first with ourselves, as Mignolo would argue, or Dabashi would say, but also having a conversation with others, because the aim is to also contribute, to global thinking. I mean, politics of referencing, yes. Francis Nyamjo has this paper about from publish or perish to publish and perish. So you can still publish in the top journal, but if there's no politics in referencing, in ensuring that we do have conversations with each other, because a referencing is having to also bring a group of people so you can have a conversation with, then you can still publish and perish. Because these matrices of citation, asking for your citation index, and you have waited and waited and waited and published and seen that the only person who has referenced you is yourself. So the politics of referencing is really important because it kills and destroys. And you can see with top scholars, and sometimes top scholars from the continent who really do not invest in having conversations, with the knowledge that has been produced outside of the continent. And you're right. I think we need to adopt a referencing politics that is more assertive, and also disobedient. And then Anne, about the infrastructure. Yeah, and there are real challenges about infrastructure. But I think when I talk about publishing and circulation and distribution, it's not necessarily about hard books. It's just having a system. I think if you get to Tanzania, I think it's Cooking and Nyoto who have Cookie Wanyota have a print on demand in Tanzania, which, POD, which can also help to circulate and distribute books, in that part of the continent. POD has revolutionized the continent extensively. So there are lots of different processes, but, but POD should not just become, it should not allow the opportunity for many others to just have their books circulated on the continent, because there is a drive to have books more accessible on the continent. But I think that drive is driven more by ensuring that the continent should have access to what is already expensive and available in Europe, rather than having to promote a conversation, within the continent. I think that if we adopt a politics which allows for governments to, for example, revise their tax regimes on books across the continent, we will have more knowledge circulated across the continent. I mean, take beer, for example. If you're trading beer in Cameroon with horrible roads, if you go to the smallest village, you're going to find beer, alcohol sold. Even with the most difficult roads. So it is possible, to transport, but I think without having to adopt a politics which is translated also into policy and tax regimes, we will not be able to do that.
Any other question?
Yeah, I see Job and Wangui have their hands up.
Okay, so let's Job Maura ask his questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, Divine, for that presentation. Now, in the course of this project, which I'm very pleased to be part of, I am amazed at how multifaceted problems spanning from social, cultural, economic, and political affect publishing in Africa. The challenges are just so many, and sometimes they look very overwhelming. By the look of it, the interventions to mitigate these challenges might take so long. And that's what I'm thinking. Are you worried, like I am, that this might take so long to solve?
Wow, that's a question about. So, if I understand you, you're not saying it's not impossible. You actually arguing that it might take long.
Yes.
But for it to happen, you have to start somewhere. And I think what we are pushing for, and like look at what Anne and her institution are doing, that they invest so much in buying books that are produced on the continent. There's a lot of material produced on the continent. I mean, if you go along the streets of Nairobi and see how many people are publishing, even doing self-publishing, you'll be amazed. If you go through the streets of Sheikh Anta Diop in Dakar and just see how many books are lying by the side of the roads, published also by people, and the kinds of conversations that people have. And I'm sure if you look across many of the cities, towns, and villages across this continent, you would see that it is actually an enterprise with people finding ways, to curate, knowledge. But we have to start somewhere, and that's why I am proposing a 2 or 3 step approach, and that the first step is just to ensure that there is quantity, that we flood the continent or the world with as much knowledge produced from this continent without paying emphasis on what has been established as quality. And it's got its issues. I mean, people are going to criticize and critique and say, look, you're trying to bring down standards, but what is standards? Standards are in themselves set a regime that we subscribe to and that we can also unsubscribe from. But that means we start a process first of building an archive, because we need to have an archive, a base from which we can begin to think, we can begin to have conversations, a base from which we can pose the kinds of questions that we would like to pose. So once we've done that first step, which is just ensuring that there is quantity, that every story must be told. Every story must be told at our own pace and on our own terms. So that's really important for the first step, And then when we have done that, we can then move to the next step, which is just having to go through and begin to define what quality is, what in these stories, what do we see as a valuable story? How do we make sense of these stories that have been curated? And I think it's an emancipatory approach that we need to take. First, make noise, make the kind of noise which Sarah Ahmad is talking about, and make noise in such a way that people just think we are making noise and complaining, because once they recognize that we are complaining, it means that we are actually doing something. And then next step, begin to sort out what complaint makes sense and the other, and then begin to build infrastructures and systems that allow us to have conversation. In the end, what we want is that the world should take us seriously, but more importantly, that we should take ourselves more seriously.
Okay, so Lena Nyahodza has a question.
Thank you so much. I would like to make a comment. Mine is not a question.
Okay.
I think this is such a great presentation, and I would like to believe that with our own mindset, if we change the way we view academia, this will come to reality, because I can see that there are a lot of publishing platforms that are emerging on the continent, and it is us who can make them a success. I've just posted a link there in the chat. We have also started an initiative with other academic libraries. I'm at the University of Cape Town, so there is Zimbabwe, there's Namibia, and I think it's actually, the platform is growing, and it is not to make a competition, but it is to also support others that would want to join. But I know there are a lot of initiatives and they are greatly appreciated. But also I would like to say, I think the challenge in academia is that as librarians, as much as we want to democratize knowledge and the sharing of information, the challenge is that the promotion system in the academia is still so colonized. So early career researchers need promotion, and as a result, they are living with this prescription of where to publish.
Thank you. Olerato?
Yes, sorry, just a brief comment. Thank you, Divine. I think that in reading your paper as well, I noticed a lot on what you say about kind of scholars also wanting to be published in Africa, because I think that the question of publishing in Africa needs to be read in tandem with wanting to be published in Africa. And I think it also ties back to Lena's comment about, well, most of how academia has kind of been framed for us new emerging scholars is that it's been framed in a very capitalistic, imperialist kind of value-oriented way, in the sense that you need to make sure that you are somewhat recognized or valuable within the international sphere. And hence that's how you kind of gain value within the academic institution that you want to enter. So as such, it's kind of like wondering how then as emerging scholars, we also attempt to navigate entering into academia, right? Whilst wanting to kind of do this more moralistic project of wanting to publish within the continent, but also still kind of get the same sort of beneficiation of being able to be within the system in the first place, right? Because I think as an emerging scholar, we are kind of forced to fall into this imperialist mindset in order to progress. And it seems like in your paper you speak about, well, some scholars having to let go of the luxuries of recognition from the West. But I think that the critique of that would be those costs are some things that people who already have the benefits can actually assume, because there are some people who are in the position already to not benefit as much from the international gaze and all these kind of like established system. So I'm wondering how you think emerging scholars should actually navigate entering into the publishing field, given the kind of structure that we are dealing with at the moment.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Ibrahima, can I answer this too?
Yeah, you can answer, and after that, I think we have to finish the sessions.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so thank you, Lena, and thank you, Olerato. I think those are really important questions and comments. I take Lena's as a comment, but also just to insist that solidarity means that we have to disrupt the notion of competition. I do think that there are existing infrastructure and platforms for disseminating knowledge on this continent that we need to be part of, and that we need to really support and recognize. I see that as things develop, everyone wants to take up the responsibilities, and roles of publishers. I do think that in an ecosystem there is a kind of an interdependence and a kind of contribution that everyone makes. And this idea of wanting to be me alone and me, I think we need to disrupt that. And collaborations are very important, but it's also important to recognize what kind of value each a player brings on board. Libraries have their role, repositories have their role, publishers have their role, distributors have their role, but the kinds of grids that one has adopted from neoliberal spaces are something that we need to really rethink. You have these institutions who want to be libraries, publishers, distributors, at the same time. I think there's a need, to professionalize and also recognize the expertise, of every space. But that's my, my opinion. And, to Olerato's question, in the end, like I argue, it's your politics. It's our politics. How do we adopt a politics that allows us to be able to do the work that we want to do? And again, I use the term decolonization also because it's being used, but I try to use the the notion of disobedience rather than on decolonize, because decolonization has come to mean anything and everything these days. It's a word that everybody drops, you know, to mean something. But also to say that decolonization is about enrichment. It's about decentering a hegemonic center, you know, as hegemonic or a hegemonic epistemologies. It's not necessarily about saying that these are not useful, because I mean, how many people here want to drop Foucault and drop Bourdieu, drop many of the thinkers that have constituted part of who they are and who they have become. But it is just enriching that these are not the only framework through which one can think, and one needs other alternatives. And this is not something new. That this is, I think, if you read post-colonial thinkers or thinkers of post-colonial theory, this is a big argument. And that's why I think when Homi Bhabha talks about a third space and hybridization, it's about creating this space that is all-inclusive, because the one is also part of the other. So this is really important. It's not saying that epistemologies, you know, from the north or the west, or however we frame it, are not important or key. They are, and we must acknowledge those. But they need to be enriched or need to be expanded, as Mbembe would argue. You know, when you ask African feminists also, you're looking at, as I've said, Yeronkyo, Majume, or Amina Mama and others. It's not necessarily about delinking completely, like what Samir Amin would, I think Samir Amin would argue, that delinking is not necessarily about having to just divorce and separate and provincialize. But it is having to enrich with what we have. So how do we enrich? But to enrich what already exists means that we need to give value to what we have. And I'm saying that we need to adopt a particular politics. And we have to adopt a particular politics to do this. And Leratu, I like to say that we have to choose whether we want to be the altar boys of Western epistemology, or we want to be part of the priests who make the mass, you know, or the saints. So I'm arguing that to build our own infrastructure, to invest in our own infrastructure, to adopt a particular politics which allows us to begin to have conversations with each other, is doing everything to not be altar boys, you know, of these Western spaces, you know.
Thank you, Divine. Thank you for your talks, which is titled Publishing Africa Towards Rebuilding a Disobedient Publishing Ecosystem, which is very useful for African scholars to build a dissenting thought. So thank you, Divine. And thank you for our colleagues who attended the seminar series. And we will give you how to say that, rendezvous, an appointment in 15 days with Abdoulaye Diallo, the director of L'Harmattan, Dakar, who will be our guest for the next seminar series. And we will pray for our colleagues, Itai Makone, and hope that he will be back with us soon with good health. Okay, thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody.